I used to think that when a film came out, whenever it came out, that didn't really matter. I used to think a good movie, regardless of whether or not it came out, whether it be January, June, August 2018, 2014, 2010, whenever it came out, a good movie should be a good movie no matter when it's released. And I remember reading a review, it was a user review, honestly, it was just an audience review of that really bad supernatural movie, The Devil Inside, from about 6 years ago. And one of the reviewers said that this would have been considered scary and very well reviewed had it come out 4 years prior. And I disagreed with that. And I didn't buy it at all. Now, this was the same thing that kind of was brought up in conversation when I was having a conversation with a professor a while ago, talking about Saw and Hostel, those movies. Those kind of gritty, torture porn, extremely violent, excessively violent horror movies. And I had a conversation with her, and she's like, when did those movies come out? And I said it was about, 04. Saw started. It was about 2004. They continued till about the end of the decade. And she said, too, she's like, that's right around the Bush era, the George W. Bush era. It is the Bush era. Guantanamo Bay, legalized torture for punishment, for information. You know what I mean? These weird waterboarding. You know what I mean? These tactics that were employed by the administration for terrorists, to combat terrorists. Now, rather than horror, nowadays, two distinct types of films have really emerged and grown stronger in the Trump era. You've gotten superhero blockbusters, which have been popular for the last 10 years, but more significantly, I've seen this year, you've got documentaries. And not just any documentaries, okay? Not just documentaries on industries, not just documentaries on this and this. You have two documentaries in particular that have made really good money the last couple weeks, and that's RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg documentary, and Won't You Be My Neighbor. So you have these two movies, I'm pulling up numbers right now, you have these two movies that are doing really well. RBG has slowly creeped its way. It's made over $10 million. And then you have Won't You Be My Neighbor, in its second week of release, made over $1 million in 90 theaters.
And real quick, for people who are just like, that's not that much money for a documentary, that is.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
For 96 theaters. To make $1 million, that's 10. You do realize that's $10,000 a theater.
Yeah.
Like that is not chump change, especially for a documentary. So, and these documentaries are informational, yes, but they're about two impossibly earnest, selfless people with hearts and a commitment to change. Now, what has been the big criticism of politics the last 2 years, that we're 2 years into the Donald Trump administration? What has been the criticism? I'll leave you to fill in the blank. Now, another documentary you could say, I don't really lump it in. It's definitely thematically relevant, but it hasn't made as much money, but it's still done okay. Is the Pope Francis documentary? Same thing. Is that it's another person, leader, mentor, definitely somebody to rally around, somebody who's principled, somebody who's charismatic, has amassed a huge following. And all of these movies, next week, Won't You Be My Neighbor is going to expand into a couple hundred theaters. RBG, I think almost went wide at one point, too. That doesn't happen for documentaries. I remember the first documentary I ever saw in theaters was Bully in 2011. Do you remember what was your first documentary seen in theaters? What was yours? Do you even remember?
No, I don't. It's hard to recall.
It wasn't Pope Francis? It wasn't the Pope Francis?
It wasn't the Pope Francis.
It wasn't. Okay, you did see one beforehand.
No, I've definitely seen a documentary before in theaters. It's just hard to recall what it was, because it's like you don't get too many of them in theaters.
Location matters. Location matters. We're coming from the suburbs. They often don't come out here. If you're in the city, if you're in Chicago, L.A., New York, Indianapolis, they generally come out there.
AMC does a great job because they have the Phantom events, which usually host a lot of documentaries. I know it was a Phantom event thing. I know it was that, and I knew I went to an AMC. I just forgot what documentary it was. I remember I did see the guy who did Super Size Me. He made another film about advertising.
Morgan Spurlock, the greatest movie ever sold.
Yeah. I remember I saw that in theaters.
Oh, you did see that? Okay.
I saw that in theaters. I'm just trying to think what the first movie I saw was, and I just really can't think of it.
But, again, it really is uncommon for documentaries, though, to get that kind of a substantial theatrical release. And then not to mention, these documentaries are not really about industry. They're about people. They're about individuals. So the one thing that I'll say is that people always condemn cell phones. Talking to my grandmother this week. People condemn cell phones. Like she was talking about, she was in a doctor's waiting room, and she said that like there was 14. She doesn't have a cell phone. She said there was like 13 people in the waiting room, and they were all on their cell phone or trying to have quiet conversation or whatever. And she was like, it's awful nowadays. But I said, here's my rebuttal for that. I always say, you know, people might be on their phones a lot. Okay, whatever. But at least people are active. They're reading. They're searching. They're engaging. They're learning.
They want to know what's going on in the world.
Or even if they're playing a game, at least they're active. Yeah. Now, I think nowadays, and this is going back to RBG and Won't You Be My Neighbor, people have a real fear of being passive. Plus some real dark politics that have propelled into the foreground. I mean, if you watch the news the last couple days, what's been the dominant news story? There's been a lot of darkness recently in the media, and there's been a lot of political uncertainty in a lot of ways too. And I believe that is a big reason why you see these documentaries about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Mr. Rogers, Pope Francis, why these documentaries are succeeding. And conversely, I think what's funny, and I'm going to talk about this after the break about Gotti, the new John Travolta movie about John Gotti, is that, and it was the same last year with LBJ. Remember, I went in the whole rant about biopics and stuff. Biopics aren't really selling that much nowadays. They're really not. A lot of people, if they want biopics, they're looking to what? Miniseries, docudramas, something that's factually tinged or is factually
not dramatized.
Based, not dramatized, not so much dramatized. And if it is fictitious, then it's something long-term like a miniseries, like a 10-week miniseries. Mm-hmm. So that's what I find really interesting is not only, because when I was a kid, when I was younger, like high school age, I really wanted more documentaries to come to theaters. And now I'm seeing two really good Oscar-worthy documentaries surface, make money, getting wider theatrical releases. People are seeing them. People are reacting to them. And am I crazy to think that the politics of today, the leadership of today, is a big driving reason why they're succeeding?
No, it does seem very reasonable. You look at something like the reason why I was looking forward to Won't You Be My Neighbor is because, God, just seeing Mr. Rogers again would be so nice. Just how caring that man was, how kind he was. And to see him on the big screen, especially during times like this, I was just thinking, man, it just seems like the perfect feel-good movie.
It really does.
You said it best, too, when you're just like, man, when you watch that trailer, isn't that the I'm not crying, you're crying trailer, basically?
I had a whole segment on it.
You want to see something like that during these times because we need something like that. We need something to look at and be like, this is how we should be in today's world as people, as
sure.
Just like, to not like, to just one another, basically. Treat everybody with kindness like Mr. Rogers would do.
Yeah, and I went, and you weren't here last week, but I went into, for the final hour, I talked about Won't You Be My Neighbor. There was a really interesting article on Reddit, and I'll end with this. We'll take a short break. Is that I went into it last week, and they were saying like, why are people crying during Won't You Be My Neighbor, the trailer? Why are people crying? Now they talked to a bunch of people who I actually commented on the YouTube trailer saying they cried. And a writer reached out and asked him, "Why do you think you cried?" And I read a couple of the testimonies, and they were really good. And the one of the best ones said, I think it's he's like, I can't speak for everybody, but I think, and he was in his 50s, and he said, I think it's the recognition that when you were a kid, those ideals to you were so important that Mr. Rogers spewed. Kindness, love your neighbor, which is going to be a big part of this documentary. Love your neighbor, embrace the differences, be kind to people. And he said, and the same person said, he's like, the culture that we live in, and he said the environment around us doesn't live up to those ideals. No. So then he says, when you're responding emotionally to that trailer and you're reminded of what Mr. Rogers taught you, you're recognizing that that all of us have failed in one way or another to live up to that.
You go on the internet today, and it's hostile out there.
It is.
Especially when it comes to political talking. I've seen family members say things, saying horrible, disgusting things to other family members. I've seen people I gone to school with that, I've never had a single problem with, but because, I say something that they disagree with, they don't rationally speak back to me. They say something harsh to me. And maybe it's because they're behind a keyboard, but it's still affecting somebody in some sort of way. It's not kind what you're doing. And it's just like, that is a very good point. You look at that and you're just reminded like, wow, there are times I've done something that has failed Mr. Rogers. I have failed Mr. Rogers. Even just that saying, I failed Mr. Rogers,
really
kind of hurts. It's like,
God.
it's
like if you're very religious, it's like the pastor. It's like the local pastor.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, you look out there in the world, and people are very hostile, whether they're talking about politics. Hell, fandoms have become hostile. You look at what's happening with the Star Wars fan base. They forced an actress, Kelly Marie Tran, who played the character Rose in Last Jedi. They chased her off Instagram because of how much hate she was receiving every day. And it's just like, why? It's not her fault you don't like the character. She was just doing her job, man. Like, you see that, and you're absolutely right. You look at this trailer and you're reminded of what we're actually supposed to be like, and you're reminded also, like, how the world is today and what's going on.
Human potential, I think, is a good way to put it.
How we should be acting compared to what we're actually doing.
Indeed. That's my point.